In the first place, it is not some kind of massive constitutional revolution, though I know that some of my honourable friends and others have suggested it is. The truth is that, as you yourself said, Mr. Speaker, earlier in the debate, the House, since its inception, has owned its standing orders. And in fact, under the principle of comity, one of the most fundamental principles of our Constitution, the courts have never sought to intervene in the proceedings of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and have recognised that the House, in each case, controls its own proceedings. And as a matter of fact, the idea that it's an ancient constitutional principle that the government should control the order paper is slightly unhistorical, if that's the right word, because it started in 1906, which, as far as I'm aware, is not part of our ancient constitution. For about 400 or 500 years, things which either were or were very much like the House of Commons controlled their own order papers, and that changed at the beginning of the 20th century. But what didn't change was the fundamental point that the way that standing orders are decided is by a majority vote in the House of Commons, and therefore they can be adjusted by a majority vote in the House of Commons, and if so adjusted, then what applies is the adjusted version. And that's actually what happens every time that there's a private member's bill Friday, when, astonishingly, the government does something which apparently we're now entreated to regard as utterly revolutionary, which is that it hands over to private members the opportunity to put forward bills, which, according to this soi-disant constitutional theory which has now been invented, must be a kind of revolution, because it's not the government putting forward a bill. But in fact, we've been doing it for years perfectly happily. So there's no revolutionary intent here at all. The second point I want to make is what the amendment does do, and it does exactly what has been described in the foregoing debate, namely, it provides simply, nothing more, an opportunity for the House of Commons to begin, and I want to stress the word begin, the process of working its way towards identifying a way forward that can command a majority in this House. And I just want to reflect for a second on my own personal history in this matter. I find sometimes from the communications, not always utterly polite, that I receive from various quarters on my iPhone, that it's supposed that I have from the beginning attempted to destroy the government's efforts to carry out an orderly Brexit. Now, this is obviously a more amusing story than the real one, but the real one is very sad. It's very ordinary. I started as an entirely loyal member of the Conservative Party. I'd never voted against the Conservative whip in my entire parliamentary career, not once. And what's more, although I voted Remain in the referendum, I was absolutely determined that we should continue our proceedings by ensuring that we fulfilled the mandate of the British people and left the European Union. And for a very long while, although I personally thought from the very beginning that the Prime Minister was unwise to set out her red lines, I swallowed my concerns about that and utterly supported her in her endeavour to get her version of leave across the line, and indeed, on frequent occasions, as several of my right honourable friends will recall, acted as a kind of broker to try to put together my ERG colleagues with other colleagues now sitting in various parts of the House to produce results, some of which are now encoded, as a matter of fact, in Section 13. It was my endeavour to make this a process which did actually enable the Prime Minister to get to the end of the road successfully. And just finally on that, I have actually fulfilled that by trying to vote for her on every occasion on which she's brought a Section 13 motion. And I apologise to members opposite for saying that I will again do that if the Prime Minister brings a meaningful vote, 3 or 4 or infinity. I will go on voting for the Prime Minister's deal because I happen to think it's perfectly okay. I'm very conscious, many members of the House don't agree with me. The problem we've been facing, and this is something on which we can all agree, all of us, all 650 of us can agree, is that we haven't been able to get a majority for her deal. This is the fact. And that is a problem. And it's a problem because if you don't have a majority for that deal and you want to leave the EU, then you are forced down only one of 2 possible tracks. One is to find an alternative, and the other is to have no deal. And it was at the point, I will in a moment, it was at the point when I discovered or surmised a few months back that there was a real possibility that the Prime Minister, I think by mistake rather than on purpose, was going to end up by taking us out without a deal, without having adequately prepared for that, that I became so concerned that I started to work on a cross-party basis with many colleagues in on both sides of the House to try to find a solution. And this modest attempt to provide the House with an opportunity to vote in the majority in favour of an alternative way forward is simply part of that process. I give way.
I'm very grateful for him to give way. And I think there is a sentiment in this House that we need to compromise somehow. And I've asked the Prime Minister earlier. For me, it was unthinkable to ever vote for a Brexit deal. Why is it so unthinkable for the members opposite to agree to support a people's vote for whatever Brexit deal we come together for?
I think what I'd say to the Honourable Lady is that if we go through the process which I hope we can inaugurate this evening, one of the things we will all have to do is to seek compromise. If we all vote for that which is our first preference, I think we almost know that we will never get to a majority solution. I don't believe there is a majority in favour of the first preferences of any person in this House. Yes.
I do thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. We've heard today from the Prime Minister, and we also heard from my honourable friend, the member for Holborn and St Pancras, that there is not going to be an immediate guarantee that whatever majority we find in this House will become the established policy of either of the two main political parties. And does he share my concern that we may actually end up in a situation where we manifest a majority for a deal that is not quite right for the Conservative Party, is not quite right for the Labour Party, and then the whip system kicks in, and then suddenly there is no majority in Parliament at all. And in my mind, that makes no deal very dangerous and very real.
The danger that the Honourable Gentleman speaks of is real. We all face it. There is a solution to it, which is to ensure that as we approach a majority, we sufficiently discuss that, not only amongst all of us on the backbenches, but also with the two front benches, to ensure that there is what I think the Shadow Brexit Secretary rightly referred to a few moments ago as a sustainable majority. What we need is not just a majority for something, but a majority for something that will continue to persist as the various stages have to be carried through. And that must be our aim.
Will you give way?
Of course I can wait.
Whose every word I agreed so far, if we say so with respect. But he just reached a few moments ago the key moment, which is, as his amendment doesn't set out precisely the form that the indicative votes will take, there's a real danger that if everybody votes for their first preference, we won't produce a majority for anything. Now, his amendment does not set out the basis upon which the indicative vote motions are to be tabled. How are we to resolve the method by which we table them? Because it's the opinion of the Honourable Member for Bishop Auckland and myself that the single transferable vote is the best way of steering people to one conclusion. It will force compromise, apart from those who will only vote for their first preference. Unless he has another better alternative, how does he guard against the danger of nothing getting a majority?
Well, my right honourable friend is asking what is clearly one of the right questions, and I give him two answers. The first is, I think we need to think very seriously, both in the next 24 hours, if this amendment does pass, about the shape of the business of the House motion for Wednesday, which will determine the process for Wednesday, to answer his question on that front, and indeed about how the process will carry forward beyond that. My own view is that, at least to begin with, it may be wiser simply to disclose where the votes lie on a plain vanilla basis, certainly, and the Honourable Lady opposite made this point very forcefully a few moments ago, certainly on the basis of all the voting going on at once, with pink slips in the lobbies at the end of the debate and not sequentially, so we don't have gaming of sequence, but on the basis where we discover which propositions that have been put forward command significant support and which do not, in the hope that actually, as politicians, and we should remind ourselves we are not just an ordinary electorate, we are politicians, we have spent our lives in this business, that we can, in the succeeding few days, zero in on something that could be a compromise, that could get a majority, having observed the lie of the land. I don't at all, and this is my second part of my answer, I don't at all discount the possibility that at a later stage, and I'm sure that there will have to be a later stage, and indeed I hope that the business of the House motion will book a slot for a later stage, that we should resort to some other method to crystallise the majority if we find that it's otherwise difficult to do. Of course,
very brief intervention. Given the process could take a few days more, as my right honourable friend clearly explains, doesn't that underline we better crack on Wednesday? And if the government won't commit to Wednesday for some peculiar unknown reason, if it doesn't and it's wind up tonight, it's absolutely essential that we pass his amendment.
I find myself in a very odd position of being slightly harder line even than my right honourable friend on this. I'm afraid I think we have to press this amendment tonight because I don't believe the government has yet got a clear view, actually, of how it would conduct this process. And I think the terms of the amendment, which have been very carefully considered over quite a long time, are structured in a way that maximises our flexibility and our capacity as a House to work together. Of course, we should work with both front benches on formulating Wednesday in the best possible way and producing a business of the House motion which, if possible, is a matter of consensus, but that's best done under the framework of this amendment, and we should press it tonight. Yes, of course.
The right honourable gentleman for giving way, and I'll be supporting his amendment tonight, and I'm happy to have put my name on it to support. And what he said about not rushing through this all in one day, I think is a very important point. I think we do need time. I think there's reasonable concerns that people don't want to suddenly be deciding on the future relationship potentially of the country for 40 years in a couple of hours in here. So I was pleased to hear what he said about this process being a start of a process, but also would he agree with me that the importance of us all getting together and setting that business House motion is that we ensure it is a fair, balanced process that enjoys the confidence of all sides of the House, all parties, all persuasions in this, and that it's not seen as loaded to one direction or the other, or indeed the government's policy.
I very thoroughly agree with the honourable gentleman about that. I think it is possible, and should be possible for us at this juncture above all, to ensure that the neutrality of the process is guaranteed. Of course we will have conflicting views about the ideal outcome, but if we're to come together on an outcome that all of us can tolerate and consequently achieves a sustainable majority, we are going to have to ensure that the process by which we have got to that is one that everybody recognises is fair and neutral as between the various options. Of course I shall, but will the two honourable gentlemen, members allow me? I did promise that I would give way to the right honourable lady, or not.
So I think it's just to confirm everything that the honourable gentleman has said about how he started off and continues to believe in the delivery of Brexit, and his description of his journey is accurate, Mr. Speaker. But he's answered my question, because it was, will he push it to the vote, and if he will, why? But I think he's made that very clear to the House.
I'm delighted to give way, of course.
Member for West Dorset for giving way, and as he knows, I strongly support his amendment, and he is making an extremely important speech. Would he agree as well, though, that the government has effectively taken 2 years to get to this point? It is not unreasonable for the House, in this unusual and difficult situation we are in, to recognise that it is likely to take us more than 1 day to attempt to do what, frankly, the government should have done quite a long time ago. And can I therefore urge him, when he's thinking about this further steps, to highlight the importance of us identifying a further day next week in order to be able to have similar debates and discussions, if we so need it, to come to a conclusion, but also urging the government to also think about what it should be doing to provide for these further votes in order to come to a consensus, and to recognise there may also need to be further binding votes in this process as well.
Unsurprisingly, given the close cooperation there has been between us, I entirely agree with everything that the right honourable lady has just said. It is of the utmost importance that the business of the House motion, when it comes on Wednesday, should also provide for a further day or days, in which to take a process which begins on Wednesday and reach a successful conclusion. And of course it is also the case that we will have to attend to the question which has been discussed this evening and began to be aired when the Prime Minister was making her statement and answering questions on it, which is the question, what will the government do if the House reaches a majority view, not for some unicorn, not for some ludicrous proposition which utterly contradicts common sense, but for a sensible way forward? How do we persuade at that stage the government to allow that majority view to be implemented? That will be a major issue. Of course.
I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for giving way, and as he knows, I support his amendment and I'm going to vote for it tonight. And I'm delighted that he's agreed that we need to move to paper ballots and end some of the gamesmanship which has been going on. The Father of the House raised the issue of the voting system, so I won't repeat that. But in addition, there are two other points which we need to bear in mind. One is whether the votes are indicative or definitive, and maybe we might move from one to the other, as the Right Honourable Member for Pontefract and Castleton said. But the other one is how an option gets onto the ballot paper, and that's also an extremely tricky, nice issue. And what I want to know from the Right Honourable Gentleman is whether he doesn't think we don't need time, perhaps, to amend the business of the House motion, because the way we do it is also a subject for discussion, as well as going on to do it.
I was with the Honourable Lady just to the end, but not quite to the end. I'm conscious that although the point that her Right Honourable friend made a minute or two ago is right, that we should allow ourselves a couple of days to do what should have been done over a couple of years, we are also under very considerable time pressure. There is a reality of the situation, which is that on the 11th we hit the buffers. And therefore, I think we shouldn't spend too much time debating the process. We should, if possible, move forward on the basis of sufficient consensus about the process not to have to debate it and get on with the substance. And to that end, I think it would be sensible if we begin this process by allowing those members who wish to put forward alternatives to do so. And there are groups of people who support whatever it may be, the people's vote as a confirmatory process or otherwise, Norway or Norway Plus, or the particular propositions hitherto put forward by the opposition, or whatever it might be. I think we need to let those members in the ordinary way formulate their propositions in their own terms. Mr. Speaker has a long record, and previous speakers have had a long record, while we're at it, of finding a way of selecting those amendments that carry sufficient weight in terms of numbers and cross-party support and so on to be considered by the House by selecting them for debate. And I think that's a perfectly proper process to use. It doesn't involve anyone of us tilting the playing field, and it enables us to proceed without too much further debate about the process. I will, but then once I've done so, I'm going to conclude.
He's been very generous. Can I say we'll be delighted to support his amendment? And the reason is, if the House controls this, it's likely that all of the options can be considered, yes, including revocation, which is the only thing we can do unilaterally. And I say that to him publicly now, partly as a pitch for it to be on the options paper, but mainly to say I rather lack the trust in the government that they would actually include all of the valid options if they were in control of the timetable.
Yeah, that's fine.
Actually, I'm very glad I did give way to the Honourable Gentleman, because, first of all, I'm obviously very grateful that he and his colleagues will be supporting the amendment. Secondly, I wholeheartedly endorse what he says. Personally, I am utterly opposed to revocation. I'm also, actually, at the moment, wholly unpersuaded of the merits of a people's vote. But both of those are obviously serious things to consider. Incidentally, I'm also radically opposed to no-deal exit. But if some of my colleagues wish to put forward that as a serious proposition, I think it is a serious proposition. It would need to be debated. So, yes, it is essential that we should be able to look at all of the serious options, not wild unicorns, but things we could actually do and could actually carry forward this process in one direction or another. And I feel very confident, Mr. Speaker, that when you look at sensibly phrased amendments as motions of very different kinds, you will choose for debate all those which are serious possibilities that the House needs to consider. That is in the interest of the House and in the interest of the nation. I want just to end by mentioning one thing which comes from a personal experience, and colleagues on the Liberal Democrat benches may recall this, as well as some of my own honourable friends on these benches. There was a time in 2010 when this nation faced another cliff edge. We were within days of the Bank of England discovering that our creditors would not finance the UK anymore. It was just after the 2010 election. Nobody had won the election. It was clear that nobody could form a government except by coalition. We were very heavily indebted due to what had happened in 2008. And what we were told by the Governor of the Bank of England was that if a coalition was not formed pretty quickly, he personally felt that the lenders would go on strike and we would have a meltdown. And, of course, there were then discussions between the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party and between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservative Party. And I was a part of the Conservative Party team on that occasion. And I was informed, when we had finished those negotiations and had brought them to a successful conclusion, that the cleverest and most experienced people in the civil service, and incidentally, I don't wish to demean the civil servant, I hardly can because my wife was a senior civil servant, had put their collective minds to the task and formed teams in order to find out whether it was possible to have a coalition agreement either between the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats or between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservative Party. And they had worked this through in awesome detail. And they had convinced themselves that it was absolutely impossible to form a coalition. It could not be done. We sat down, and 4 days later, there was a coalition agreement. And why did that come about? It came about because it was politicians who sat down and weren't concerned with the kinds of things that people are concerned with when they are very brilliant administrators, but were concerned with trying to find out how to accommodate the essential requirements of the other side. This is, of course, the process that should have been gone through 2 years back in this connection. But we have the opportunity to do it now, and I hope and pray that the House, if it does vote for this amendment, will not see this simply as a set of votes in the abstract, but as the beginning of a process in which, by discovery of where the land lies, we can then come together and find a consensus and get a majority and carry forward in a sensible way. I'm terribly sorry, but I won't give way because I'm going to conclude.
Very good.